invitation. So let me just start by saying that I'm going to talk today about unlocking the power of purpose. And the two things I want to mention at the get-go here are these. Number one, purpose is not a luxury for the few or the elders or the well-educated or the whatever you want to put in there. Purpose is fundamental. And we talk about purpose as medicine. Well, I'm going to get into that with a little bit of background so you have some confidence in that. But purpose is fundamental to health, to healing, to happiness, and to longevity. And I say longevity, however, it is age agnostic. Young people, midlife people, older people, all benefit from having a reason to rise in the morning, which is purpose. Second thing is we're talking about unlocking versus finding. Purpose is not out there to be found. It's in here waiting to be unlocked and named and practiced. And so I just want to say that. And the other thing I want to say is about unlocking. I'm going to talk about purpose with a big P and purpose with a little p. The big P purpose is kind of like, oh, that's maybe bigger than me, broader than me. You know, I can get around to that some other time in life, which may be true. But the little p purpose is what can you do on a day-to-day basis to really live purposefully, work purposefully, and parent purposefully, etc. So unlocking is going to be about the big P and the little p. So let's talk about the three things I'm going to get into now. I'm going to talk about purpose as presence, purpose as a path, and purpose as a practice. So one of my colleagues, Scott Miller, when you call him on his iPhone here and you don't get him, he answers the phone in this way. At the sound of the tone, please leave your answer to life's two eternal questions. Who are you and what do you want? Well, you may smile, but who are you and what do you want comes to us in many ways and many forms throughout our life. And so we need to have presence and path and practices to answer those questions. Oftentimes, when I talk about, people say, have you got a minute? Can you tell me what I should do with the rest of my life? I'll say, well, there's three things to consider: money, medicine, and meaning. We need enough money to live our lives. We need medicine, but medicine is really about health. It's not about pharmaceuticals or drugs, but it's about health. But we also need meaning. Everyone knows people who have enough, perhaps money, maybe enough health, but not meaning in what their lives are like. And there's other people who have meaning, but not enough health or enough money. We need all three: money, medicine, and meaning. As E.B. White said, who's an American author, many years ago, he said this, one of my favorite quotes about purpose. He says this, that, you know, when you wake up in the morning, I arise in the morning, torn between a desire to save the world and a desire to savor the world. This makes it hard to plan the day. Well, saving and savoring are both essential, but we need presence, path, and practice to savor and to save. And not save is not literally save, but to make a difference with our lives, to leave a legacy with our lives. So the purpose question is fundamental, is why? Why do I get up in the morning? When I arise, other than getting a nice cup of coffee, if you like coffee or something else, what gets you up in the morning? And I would say this, that purpose is a verb. It's not just a comment that you put on the wall or you put in your legacy. Purpose is a verb. It's an action. Action precedes clarity. You want clear purpose, we act purposefully on a day-to-day basis. There are 1,440 purpose moments in a day. Think about that. 1,440 purpose moments in a day. Now, if you sleep, of course, that would reduce that number. Well, let's just use 1440 as a number of purpose moments where you can make a difference in just one person's life. A kind word, a hug, an email, a phone call, something in that 1 minute, that one of 1440 that makes a difference in somebody else's life. So why do you get up in the morning, as I said, is fundamental, not a luxury. We need a reason to rise, which is what I'm going to talk about now. So let's talk for just a minute about, because this is Purpose as Medicine, the research. So the research is, can you imagine a pill like this, which was held up to me before I did my PBS special when I was traveling the country, going to neuroscience labs, learning about purpose and the research behind it as it related to health and healing and longevity and the things I claimed earlier. But one of those researchers, Dr. Majid Fatoui at Johns Hopkins in Maryland, said this. He said, Richard, imagine this pill. And he held up this pill. That's him. He said, this pill will reduce macroscopic stroke by 51%. It will basically work with Alzheimer's and quality of life by increasing our quality of life, even with Alzheimer's. And it will help with sleep apnea and other sleep disorders up to 16%. And mortality, 57% of people who have research live longer. I mean, have purpose rather, live longer. And so this is the surprising science that for so many people that seems like more of a spiritual or a philosophical or a psychological question, all of which it is, but it also is a scientific question about how we live our lives. So purpose helps stay resilient in all that's going on and having a reason to rise in addition to eating well and having a goal and having good sleep and other health related things is, as I said earlier, is fundamental. I spoke recently at the American College of Lifestyle Medicine. In San Diego, there was a conference. There was only 100 people invited through the American College of Lifestyle Medicine. I was sponsored by the Blue Zones to be the only practitioner in this conference. The rest were all scientists and researchers, people I actually quote in my books, including the 4th edition of The Power of Purpose, which just came out this year. 4 editions. It's been out 40 years, The Power of Purpose book. The new book has 10,000 fewer words and 50% more content than before. So I'm learning the future belongs to the learners, not just the knowers. And I'm learning along the way with the research that's going on. So let's talk about the 3 things I talked about before. So let's start with unlock your presence. So I said that I'm going to talk about big P and little p purpose. And I've been interviewing elders, people over the age of 60, for many, many years. And I talk about this in my books. I write about this, I should say. And I found these 3 things when I interview people kind of in the later stages of their life and say, if you could live your life over again and be present differently, what would you do? And they say 3 things. Number 1, I would be more reflective, which is what we're doing today. We're being reflective. We're stepping back and looking at our lives, looking at the big picture, looking at our choices. Secondly, they said if they could live their life over again, they would take more risks the second time around. Risks, particularly meaning choices they made around work and relationships. Those are the 2 big areas we spend the most of our time in our relationships and in our work. We spend 60% of our life's time working. And so they would be more authentic. And I'll talk about what that authenticity really means in just a minute. And so reflection, risk, and the 3rd thing was meaning. Meaning matters. Every person of the thousands of people I've interviewed over the last 5 decades of my life, every single one has said they want their life to matter. Somehow they want to make a difference in life, not just show up and check out, not having made a dent in the universe. So we'll talk about how we're going to go about that. But let me stop with this one just to say this. Here is the universal purpose. So unlock your presence. What does that mean? It means this: grow and give for life. And that's it. If anything that you get out of this talk today, growing and giving for life on a day-to-day basis, that's the power of purpose. And unlocking your growth and giving is what I want to talk about. So there is a rise of purpose anxiety, however. There is today people with, first of all, you see the globe here. People are saying, oh, I'm not saving the planet, the climate crisis, or doing something big enough. No, I've already said purpose is a big P and purpose is a little p. And I want to talk about both of those, but mainly I want to talk about the little p. Secondly, people say, well, you're lucky. You figured out your purpose early in life, but me, God didn't whisper in my ear, or I didn't learn from my family or along the way what my purpose is, and so I'll just wait. Well, purpose is not a matter of luck. It's a matter of practice, which I'm going to talk about. And third, purpose, as I already said, is not a luxury for the wealthy, for the educated, for the elders, etc. Purpose is fundamental at all ages and stages. So let's talk from there about the fallacy of big P purpose. This is my Uber driver in Denver, Colorado. I was going to do a talk at the Noble Institute of Longevity at Denver University, and I landed at Denver Airport, and I got an Uber driver to take me to downtown, and this is him. And he said, "What are you going to do, Mr. Leider?" I said, "I'm going to talk about the power of purpose and as it relates to aging at this Noble Institute." And he said, "Really?" And he turned to the mirror like that, and he said, "How old do you think I am, Mr. Leider?" And I said, "Not a clue." He said, "I'm 83. I said, 83? And you're an Uber driver. What was that? What's that all about? And he said very quickly here, he said, "Well, I retired and I didn't figure out what to do with the rest of my life. I thought it was going to be just a dream holiday. But then my wife got sick and I had to caregive her, which I don't deny. I mean, I don't resent, but, and then she died. And so after retiring and my wife dying after a number of years of caregiving her, I had to figure out something. I was sitting on the couch watching 47 hours of TV a day. I was drinking too much. I was not happy because I was a salesperson in my former life. I love people. I love to be with people and problem solve. I needed to get out with people again. So I decided I would try Uber. And here I am with you. And so we had a great, great conversation. And he said this, which I'll never forget. He said, "Mr. Leider, isolation is fatal. Going life alone at any stage alone, isolation is fatal, and particularly at different stages of life where we have triggering events, etc." So the fallacy of a big P purpose, he says, I don't have a big P purpose. He said, you just taught me about little P purpose. My little P purpose is to get up every day and drive somebody someplace, but learn from them and serve them in certain ways. And so isolation is fatal. And the power of little p purpose. Let's look at that. This person, who you see in this next slide, is Terry Fox. You see he's got one leg. Terry Fox was 18 years old in Toronto, in Vancouver, Canada, and he's now an iconic hero across the world, but across Canada for sure. One of the best known people in all of Canada. If you haven't heard of him before, Terry Fox was the 18-year-old who lost his leg to cancer. And when he was in the cancer ward trying to figure out what the rest of his life would be like, what's next, he said, somewhere the hurting's got to stop. I need to give these other kids in the cancer ward who may not make it out of here hope. So what am I going to do? I'm going to run across Canada. In fact, I'm going to run a marathon a day and raise $1 million for the Canadian Cancer Society. He was 18 years old. His parents didn't think this was a great idea. And he decided he found a friend, Doug. He had a friend, Doug, who had a rickety old van. And they put a sign on the side of the van that said, Marathon of Hope, bringing hope. And they traveled, they had no money or little money, and they traveled all the way to the east coast of Canada. He dipped his prosthesis, his one leg, artificial leg, in the water, and he started running a marathon a day. Nobody had a clue who he was, not a clue. And he started, and they slept in this van at night, freezing. They ate junk food, and they tried to raise, a little money every day as he ran a marathon a day. And Doug would put out the hat, and people would put in a loonie, a dollar, and eventually, by the time they got to Nathan Phillips Square in Toronto, there were 10,000 people ringing the center, the square, giving money, cheering, bringing out their own sense of hope in life. When I saw Terry, it was here. I saw Terry Fox, and 25 years ago, he was still running a marathon a day. But I saw him outside of Thunder Bay, where he actually ended his run. He ended his run because the cancer had spread to his lungs, and he had to go back to Vancouver and get get medical help, and he didn't make it. He lived another year, not a good year, but he died 1 year after I saw him. But this is where he ended. This is outside of Lake Superior, Thunder Bay, Canada, and he basically became an international and a national hero, the Marathon of Hope. He not only raised $1 million, but I won't go into all the science and the details or the research or what's happened. He's so far, the Terry Fox Foundation, Terry Fox Fund, has raised over $850 million for the Canadian Cancer Society. He's become, like this statue, iconic hero of hope for so many people. And he proves to me, that purpose is age agnostic. He was 18. And look, at 25 years later, he's become whomever. Now, that's not what I'm suggesting for you, but the power of little p purpose, doing something every day. For him, running a marathon a day can make a difference in life years and years later. So it's all about choice and choosing. And one of my teachers was, as this next slide shows, it says choose. Well, Viktor Frankl was a Vienna, Austria. He was a psychiatrist, neurologist in Vienna, who at the height of his work was taken by the Nazis in a boxcar with his pregnant wife, Tilly, his parents, his siblings, all shoved into a cold, freezing boxcar and taken to Auschwitz by the Nazis. And he lived 3.5 years and through three concentration camps, but his family all died. And he came out and he wrote what I consider the seminal book about purpose and purpose in medicine. He was a doctor. And he said this in the book, Man's Search for Meaning. He said, the last of the human freedoms is to choose one's attitude in any given circumstances, to choose one's own way. Well, what choice do you have in a concentration camp? Well, you have the choice for hope, to hope you'll get out of here, hope that somehow this will end. You can give somebody else a hug, a kind word. You can give somebody else a crust of your bread or a slurp of your soup. But he said people who had activated that choice, that sense of choice in life, didn't always make it, but they did better. And he did better as a result of that. And so we all have choices in life. And as part of what this, particularly with youth of all levels and with elders of all levels, we need to choose what are we going to really pay attention to. And so as Frankl talked about tragic optimism, he said, we all have tragedies, we all have despair, but we also can have optimism. We can choose our way, how we deal with those adversities in life. And he said this, because I studied with him back way back in 1968. I say when dinosaurs were still roaming the earth for some of you, but that's a joke. But the key is I studied for a week with Frankl, and he said this: don't ask what is your choice, what is your purpose. Ask this: say yes to life. Say yes to life. What is life asking of me in this set of circumstances today? And then you make your choice based on that. So let's look now at some of our choices. So we talked about presence. Let's talk about path. Unlocking your path that we all go through, as I talked about the elders in life. We look at life from the big picture, from the longevity picture, and along the way, there are curves in the road. There are adversities that we come up with, and we find ourselves oftentimes in limbo, periods of uncertainty. And there are three things to think about with unlocking your path. And I'm going to take a little bit of a dive into this, but number one is small p purpose. With your path, find things that you can derive from purpose on a day-to-day basis. Don't just look at the long haul. Look at today. How can, as Frankl said, how can I make choices today to make a difference, a small p difference in someone else's life? Secondly, find an attainable goal. What's your goal for your life or your work or your relationship or whatever it is? But something attainable, not just a bucket list, a dream list, but what's an attainable goal for this next month, this next year that can be a choice that you can activate. And third, make sure that you feel that life is worth living. And with elders, that's why I wanted to interview elders. And they said life is worth living, but there are choices and there's adversity and things we need to do along the way. So as Leonard Cohen said in this next slide, he said this in his beautiful song called Anthem. He said, there's a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. We all have cracks in maybe not everything, but cracks in our life, in our work, in our health, in our relationships, in our finances. There are cracks in everything, but that's how the light gets in. Everyone on this call is an experiment of one. You all have your own path. You all have your own choices. But with that crack, don't go it alone. As my Uber driver said, isolation is fatal. Sometimes we're pushed by pain, and sometimes we're pulled by possibility when these cracks come. We see a crack and maybe see a possibility, or maybe we see pain. And to get through that, I suggest this: have a sounding board. Create a personal sounding board, kind of like a kitchen cabinet, or who you'd sit around the fire, or who you'd talk with about your life. And in that sounding board, there's one really or a couple critical people. A sounding board, your kitchen cabinet. One is a committed listener who listens to you without always fixing you. They're not trying to fix you, they're trying to listen to you and help you fix yourself. Secondly, who's a wise elder? Someone who's been through their own cracks and has some advice. Third, who's a wise younger? Somebody who's younger than you and maybe doesn't see the cracks the same way, but sees the possibilities. And fourth, a purpose partner. So who would be your purpose partner? Who would you talk with about purpose and about the practices that I'm going to talk about in just a minute? So when you look at a path, there's sometimes a fixed mindset. I'm going to go through this quickly for time's sake, but there's a fixed mindset. I grew up with this fixed mindset: childhood, adolescence, adulthood, retirement, old age. Grow up, grow old, and die in certain ways. What did you want to be? What did you want to do when you grew up back there in childhood or adolescence? And how did that turn out? Sometimes we live what is a default life. We live the life that someone else chose for us. But the key is really not that, but to find out what kind of life you want to live. So sometimes we look in the rearview mirror and we look at the past and we look at people in our lives. And so, the rearview mirror slide shows, the rearview mirror is small, but sometimes we live our lives kind of a default life by looking at the past and looking at how we grew up, et cetera, rather than creating the future, reimagining what's possible. And so I'm for what I call a growth mindset. And the growth mindset is different, as you can see here. Not only the sunlight, still has childhood, still has adolescence, still has adulthood, but then there's dip. That dip in the research and the science is called the U curve of happiness. Sometimes along the way, we kind of get depressed, we get down, things don't go our way. And there's that U curve. But look at the upward spiral there. Isn't that amazing? We actually grow up twice. We grow up from adolescence to adulthood, and we also grow up from adulthood to elderhood. There are three hoods in life: childhood, adulthood, and then this new life stage, as you see here, elderhood. We've added 3 decades to life in the last years. 3 decades, 30 years, longer than my parents lived or my grandparents, et cetera. Maybe we retire, maybe we don't, hopefully, but life doesn't have to be a downward decline, a downward spiral. We can reimagine life at different times along the way. And so the U curve of happiness is not only back at adolescence, what did you want to be or do when you grew up? And how did that turn out? But now, whatever stage you are in life along this curve, who do you want to be next? What's next in your life? Do you have a growth mindset? As I said, the subtitle of my book is Grow and Give for Life. Are you growing? Are you giving along the way? That's what keeps people alive and helps with the science, as I said earlier, the research on resilience. And so the windshield is bigger than the rear view mirror. It's 100 times bigger for a reason than a rear view mirror. It's important to learn from the past, to learn lessons from the past, etc. But it's more important, or as important, to look through the windshield and say, what are my possibilities? What's next? What is the good life for me? What is the possibility that with my life? What are my goals? The good life, as I've researched and written about it in my book, Repacking Your Bags, is this: 4 characteristics through the windshield to a good life. The good life is living in the place you love, with the people you love, doing the work you love, with purpose, with a reason to rise. So no matter what age or stage or adversity you're facing today, are you living in a place you love? Are you living with people you love? Are you doing work, whether that be volunteer work, caregiving work, paid work, whatever it is? Are you doing work you love on purpose, with a reason to matter, with a reason to rise, to get up in the morning and make a difference in at least one person's life every single day? So let's look at a few practices now. We've looked at we've looked at presence, we've looked at path, and now let's talk about unlocking your practice. I had lunch a while back with the happiest man in the world. Now, before you smile, you can Google this later. The happiest man in the world in the research is a man named Matthew Ricard. He's a Frenchman who's a scientist who went to India to study Buddhism, became a Buddhist monk, and stayed for the rest of his life in India, and became a translator for the Dalai Lama, and became a scientist, researcher on altruism and on the practice of purpose in life. And so he taught me this. He said, Richard, I took him to lunch. I'm a senior fellow at the University of Minnesota Bachman Center for uh, uh, Healing and Purpose, Spirituality, Healing, and Purpose. And I took him to lunch because he was going to do a talk. Being the happiest man in the world, he was going to do a talk for about 5,000 people. And I had to, being the senior fellow, take him to lunch. I didn't have to, I got to, and then introduce him after lunch to the audience. So at lunch, we're standing and he's in his saffron robes with his shaved head, and I'm, in my normal work clothing. And I said, "So, Matthew, how do you get to be the happiest man in the world?" And he looked at me and smiled and he said, "Only one word, practice." I went, "Practice? You got to tell me a little more. I got to introduce you." And he said, "Well, they measured my brain waves when I meditated and I thought about certain things, and I was able to light up the pleasure center in the brain, the happiness center, if you will, more than even the Dalai Lama." And he said, "I don't know, but I know that I've been practicing positive thinking, purposeful life, making a difference in life, etc. And somehow it measures itself in our bodies and in the brain." And so action, he said, precedes clarity. Acting purposefully by making a difference in one person's life every day, the 1440 purpose moments, precedes clarity. We get to be clear. It feels good. Our health is better. We live longer, etc., like we've talked about before. So the power of practice is such. I call, what does that mean? The call. The next slide, the call. When this is actually a Viktor Frankl concept, but he wrote on the blackboard the line from failure to success, that horizontal line. He says you can see yourself on the outer world somewhere between failure and success. And then he drew the vertical line between meaning or purpose at the top and despair at the bottom. And he said sometimes we have, next slide, a job. We have a job and we're not necessarily so successful financially, but we're paying the bills and we're not in despair, but it's not what we really like to do. And then he said the next slide sometimes is a career. Sometimes we're moving up the ladder of success. We're doing things. We're growing and giving perhaps. But not along the way, sometimes we get bored, we get burned out. It's not a great fit for us, but it's paying the bills, and not only that, but it's a little bit more fulfilling. And then the next slide at the top, he said, and sometimes there's a mission. We have a job, but our mission may be outside of work. It may be in our faith-based community. It may be in our other part of our community, our family. But we have a mission that gives our life meaning on a day-to-day basis, but isn't actually our job. But then Frankl put in the next one, which is calling. And that's where I said, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to help people discern their calling. Calling is success with fulfillment, success with meaning. How do we get that? We get it through what I call the napkin test. So this is just simplifying things for our call today. The napkin test is gifts plus passions plus values equals calling. And calling is another word for purpose. It's kind of more of a vocational word, maybe a job or career, but a day-to-day word that's maybe a little more accessible for people. Where did the napkin test come from? Well, I used to be in what used to be called personnel. Now it's called human resources. And I used to be a human resource officer in what is now US Bank across the country. It used to be called First Bank. But I had something which I call a side hustle. A side hustle. Some of you are probably smiling. A side hustle means I'm trained as a psychologist, as a counselor, as Jess so fondly or so thoughtfully rather said about my background. And so I did something which I call lunch hour limited. Lunch hour limited. You buy me lunch and I coach you on your career or your calling. And so I had a lineup of people at the bank and even outside the bank that wanted coaching help because back then, way back then, when I was in personnel or human resources, there weren't a lot of career counselors. There wasn't a lot of what is now, uh, all over the place available to many, many people. And so I said, when people said, well, we only have an hour, what should I do? And I said, well, take out your napkin and write down this formula. Gifts plus passions plus values. Let's talk about these things, and then let's meet again and let's see what you come up with to see if what you're doing is aligned with who you are and your own desire for authenticity and motivation. And gifts, let's just talk about that. Are you using your gifts on things you feel you care about, passionate? If not passionate, you at least are curious about, in environments that really fit you and honor you and your voice and your values. A gift has 4 characteristics. A gift is like a talent, but a gift has 4 characteristics. Number one, it's something you love to do. You might not have a degree in it. You might not have gone to school in it. You might have not a certificate or even a job, but it's something that you think about that I love to do this. And secondly, a gift is something that others observe you being pretty good at. Even though you don't have all the credentials, et cetera, they notice that you love to do this and that you're pretty good at it. And third, even if you're not that good at it, you can't remember learning it. I don't know. I've been just doing this since I was a kid. I was really good at it. For me, it would have been listening to people's stories. I don't know where that came from, but I love listening to people's stories and discerning why they're doing what they're doing. So one of my gifts is what I call radical listening or deep listening. And the 4 things I love learning, or we love learning more about it. So a gift is something you love to do, others observe you loving to do it or doing it pretty well. And third, can't remember learning it. And if you can't remember learning it, oftentimes you don't give yourself much credit for it. Well, I don't have a degree in it, but I sure am loving it and I'm pretty good at it. And so the 4th thing is you love learning more about it and hanging out with people. So the napkin test is something I challenge you to try, and try it with a purpose partner, somebody in your sounding board who you could sit down and do it with. So let me pull together before we stop and see what kind of challenges or questions you have. Let me stop or let me end with 3 practices, tests. The first test was the napkin test. The next test is the mirror test. And so what I challenge you to do is take my universal purpose statement that I've studied for decades, grow and give for life, and write grow and give on a Post-it. Here's mine. Just write grow and give on a Post-it and put it on your mirror or a mirror, someplace that you can, in fact, see it tomorrow morning. And when you get up in the morning, ask yourself this: how am I going to grow and give today for life? 1,440 purpose moments in a day. How am I going to grow and give for life today? And at the end of the day, before you go to sleep at night, look at the Post-it on your mirror again and ask yourself, how did I do? Did I grow today? Was I curious about something that I learned a little bit more about? You don't have to go to school. You don't have to read a book. You don't have to grow in some formal way, but somehow you challenged yourself and you lived in the question of, how am I growing? Because curiosity is absolutely fundamental to purpose. Curiosity is fundamental. What keeps you up at night when you talk about growing? What keeps you up at night? Meaning, what are the things that you're basically studying or thinking about or reading about or talking to others about or watching a YouTube about or a TED Talk, etc. The founder of TED, by the way, Richard Saul Warman, who I met, said that TED was founded based on what he called the ultimate dinner conversation: curiosity. He was curious about, and he is a architect and an urban planner. He was curious about technology, entertainment, design. That's TED, technology, entertainment, design. If you had a dinner party and you had someone from each of those 3 areas together talking about a particular question, digging into a particular question, what would come out of that? And what came out of that was TED. He took it on stage after doing ultimate dinner parties, and ultimately there are millions of people every single day who are tuning into TED Talks because they're growing. They're interested in growing. They're curious. And curiosity is fundamental to purpose. If you're not curious about yourself, if you're not curious about others, curious about life, you're probably not living and growing purposely. So grow and give. And at the end of the day, before you go to bed, ask yourself, how did I do today? Did I grow and give? And then the third test is the ultimate test. At the end of our lives, I talked about interviewing elders from youth to older people and asking them if they could live their life over again, what would they do differently? And ultimately, they said they would make each day count. Life goes very, very quickly, and we keep postponing and postponing and delaying. Maybe we miss life in certain ways. And so making each day count. I've talked about purpose. I've talked about presence. I've talked about I've talked about presence, path, and practice, and to make each day count because mattering matters. And so to kind of summarize it up in the final minute or two here, and that is, I think that with presence is the small p that really counts ultimately. The small p presence purpose presence makes a difference ultimately in our legacy and the end of our lives. Where we derive meaning from our daily choices. And then the second thing is with path, and that is making sure that we're on a path that is a life worth living, doing things that you think matter, because mattering matters. And with practice, having attainable practices, daily goals that are simple and attainable, not just our bucket list. So, Jess, I will stop there and say thank you to everybody and open it up to whatever might want to happen in the next minutes here.
Sounds great. Thanks, Richard. So yeah, we have some time now for questions with Richard. If you want to drop those in, there should be a Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. You can just post your questions in there. I will read them aloud to Richard. While folks are getting ready to do that, Richard, I had one question for you that wanted to kind of bring back before the webinar started today. You and I were talking a little bit about an epidemic among our youth, kind of around purposelessness, and I know our community is really concerned about that. What can we do for our young people? What is driving
Yeah.
that? How can we help them discover a sense of purpose at an earlier age?
Well, everybody's an experiment of one, so I don't want to generalize about what's driving it for you personally, but you know, at different times in our life, we have adversity, and there's a lot of that going on right now for a whole lot of different reasons. But isolation is fatal. Going it alone is not a good idea. Dr. Vivek Murthy, who was the uh, uh, Surgeon General under uh, Obama and Biden, and who recently he came out with a book called Together. And he did a lot of scientific research on what to do about this despair and with youth and with people of all ages. And he said he came up with his book called Togetherness. And he said relationships are fundamental, purpose is fundamental, and service is fundamental. So if you want to help yourself or help others, find a way to serve. The Uber driver found a way to serve. That was kind of a funny way to think about it. But when we serve, we get outside of our own ego and we get into our soul. We get into the reason we're here. Spoiler alert, we're here to serve. Now, that doesn't mean being a servant, but serving means giving, growing and giving. How am I giving today makes a difference in our bodies, our health, our longevity, and all of that. So, to serve is one way to think about it. A second way to think about it is for adults to become mentorns. Now, a mentor came from my colleague Chip Conley, who said mentor is somebody who is not only a mentor to younger people, but also an intern. And so that means a learner. Growing and giving is both, like bookends to each other in certain ways. So being a mentor, what can I learn from this younger person? And what can I give to this younger person as a mentor? So creating a community of mentors, I think, who serve not easy, but the research is there. Surgeon General, many others who I mentioned earlier have come up with growing and giving is fundamental to our communities, to our families, to each other. How we do that, everybody's an experiment of one.
Wonderful, thank you. Next question is, a lot of people say they want to live with purpose, but they don't know where to begin. Do you have a suggestion for one simple habit or daily practice you'd suggest for getting started? And I know you mentioned several today, but to get started, one simple daily practice.
Well, the napkin test, followed by the Post-it. The Post-it works. I still, to this day, several years later, after doing a PBS special, I get emails from people who don't know me, but saw the PBS special or re-saw it, re-looked at it and said, I still have this Post-it on my mirror. And I always feed back, I said, why? And they'll say, because it works. If I get up and am intentional with my life, I intend to make a difference in someone else's life, I feel better, I do better. And so making, 1,440 purpose moments in a day, that's 1 minute to make a difference in somebody else's life. When you do that, if you do the Post-it test for a week and do it with a purpose partner, check in with that person every day or every other day and just say, how did you grow and give today? All of a sudden, there's a certain lightness, a certain aliveness that comes from being intentional with life. So getting started, as I said, action precedes clarity. You'll get a big P purpose by little P purpose moments.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Richard. I don't see any other questions popping up in the chat right now, but we so appreciate the time that you gave with this talk today. This was very uplifting and hopeful message. I'm excited to take back and share this recording with others in our community.